For our first two notebook samples, we're going to just learn about how to add seam allowance to a dart. There's two different techniques. The first one is trimmed, and the second one is by folding. So we'll start with a sloper from our textbook. You'll just print out a copy and use this sloper for this technique. And you'll see there is a dart here at the waist. When the dart gets sewn together, it makes our front bodice have a third dimension. It makes it round instead of flat. Now when you sew a garment, you need seam allowance, you need extra fabric, and you sew away from the raw edge of your fabric. So we're going to add seam allowance to this pattern because currently this pattern does not have any seam allowance, and I'm going to show you one of the techniques on how to add seam allowance to the dart. For notebook sample number 1, I'm going to add seam allowance around my pattern. Seam allowance is the extra bit of fabric that you have that you allow in your pattern so that you can actually sew on your sew line. This is where we want to sew. So when we cut out our fabric, we want it a little bit bigger. So that's called seam allowance. So you can choose what seam allowance you would like. Different people like to work with different seam allowances. You just have to communicate what you allotted for in the pattern. Your book, I think, sometimes does 1/4 inch seam allowance around the neckline and the armhole. You can do 1/4 inch seam allowance if you like. We will be sewing some of these pieces together, and some students prefer to sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance, so just add 1/2 inch seam allowance if that's what you would like. It doesn't matter what seam allowance you add. What matters is that you communicate how much was added so that the sewer knows how much to sew with. So for this one, I'm going to add 1/2 inch at the shoulder seam. And I love this ruler. This ruler is 2 inches wide. So this line would be 1 inch away from the edge. I only want 1/2 inch, so I go halfway. And I'm just going to go ahead and draw a line there. And before I forget, I'll just write 1/2 inch seam allowance. My neckline, I guess I'll do 1/4 inch. Kind of lining up my shoulder just to sort of get started with that seam allowance. And there we go. Okay. So now I make sure this 1/4 inch line, it's 2 boxes away from the edge, stays on my neckline. So I try to only draw while my neckline is actually on this 1/4 inch line here. The ruler's a little long. I'm going to scoot it up. And then when I finish, I get it so it's perpendicular to the center front. And I go ahead and add that. Okay. And I'll continue my center front. Now my center front, I would like to cut on the fold. So I don't need seam allowance because I don't intend to sew it together. So I'll leave that as is. I'm going to add 1/4 inch around this armhole as well. So my curves aren't very curvy. You can kind of see where I turn. They're a little sharp. So, you know, it's optional. If you would like it to be nice and pretty, you can use some of these pattern drafting rulers to help make a more smooth shape. Sometimes that's helpful. There we are. That's fine. Okay, great. And then I'm going to do 1/2 inch seam allowance for my side seam. Okay, I'm going to do 1/2 inch at my waist. Okay, and now I'm going to add seam allowance for my dart legs. So I like to sew with 1/2 inch, so I will do 1/2 inch. And I mean, I guess technically I could have kept drawing the line further, but you stop where the dart legs intersect. So that's how I got that point. It was just because they intersected there. And I can connect these. These are not intersecting yet, so I'll just draw them a little bit longer so they will intersect as well. Okay. Okay, so now the last thing I need to do is label my pattern. So the next step is to label the pattern piece. So in Canvas, I put a list of how I would like you to label your patterns. The first step is to start off with, use a ruler to help you draw straight lines. I see some people sometimes write crooked or at angles. We really want to go very straight, so that way when we look at our pattern, we know this is the top and this is the bottom of the pattern. So, so start off by using a ruler to help you draw those lines. Next, each style needs a name. This could be notebook sample number 1, could be the style name. If I was designing a full garment, if this had sleeves, let's say, and a collar, I would put notebook sample number 1 on every single piece. But this one we only have one pattern piece, so that's kind of easy. Then each pattern piece also needs a name. This is bodice front. So it's already written there. I'll go ahead and use that for the pattern name. Okay, let's see here. So that's number 3. Number 4 is how many are we gonna cut? So if I was actually gonna sew up this garment and this is on the fold, I really only need 1. We'll just cut 1 on the fold. So I can write that here. So cut 1 on fold. We should write what size. This is half size. That's fine for our notebook samples. We can leave that for the size. Number 6, your name. This is so important, especially in a shared classroom. Sometimes we'll mix up pattern pieces, so make sure your name is on it. And then also please write the date. This is especially important for when we go and make changes to a pattern. Sometimes you forget which one's the new one, so it's always great to have the date. And then the last but most important thing is to draw a grain line. So in this case, our grain line is actually parallel to our fold line here, so I just need to draw a line parallel to that. It's extremely important to use a ruler when drawing the grain line. We don't want a crooked one. And I just draw my little arrows. And then the grain line is going to tell us how to place this pattern piece on fabric so that we put it the right direction. Because sometimes if you sew or cut out a piece of pattern that's cut out a little crooked, when you wear it, the garment will try to twist and it'll fit funny. So, so it's always important to know where the grain line of the fabric should be. Okay, great. So this one's ready to go. All I'm going to do now is I suppose just cut it out, and the next step is to cut it out of fabric and sew up my fabric sample. When sewing up our sample, because we're learning, I highly recommend marking your sew lines. It makes it a lot easier to guarantee that you're sewing in the right spot. Technically, I mean, if you sew with your 1/2 inch seam allowance, you don't need to mark your sew line because it's 1/2 inch from the raw edge, but just to make sure, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and mark it. So this is some tracing paper. It has chalk on it. I can use that. I can put the chalk side down and add pressure, and it will add lines to my fabric. So I'll line up my pattern, and then I put my chalk paper underneath of it. And then with a tracing wheel, I can apply pressure, and it should add the chalk lines, and I would sew directly on those chalked lines. Okay, it's kind of hard to see in the camera, but I can see my yellow lines. I went ahead and just used a Sharpie and traced on the yellow chalk so the camera could see it. I feel like the camera couldn't pick up that yellow chalk, but you can see it now because I used the Sharpie. So to sew together, I bring right sides together, and I fold at the tip of my dart, and I line up my 2 dart legs, and I'm gonna sew right here, backstitch. I'm gonna sew all the way down, and then you really should not backstitch the dart tip. Instead, you should hand tie a knot. So I'm gonna go ahead and take this to the sewing machine and sew it up. This is what our first little half-scale bodice will look like. After it's sewn, it's 3-dimensional, it fits our little dress form. We just still need to sew up this side.